I haven't been here in over 30 years. The Army base was located a few miles from Coxtown, a small town in the north that grew out of a village, which had formed a symbiotic relationship with the barracks. When the barracks closed, the town needed to reinvent itself in order to survive. Coxtown became home to a new symbiosis: logistics. As the world of next-day, same-day delivery became popular, logistics centers filled the void the barracks left behind. With road, rail, and viable links to a nearby regional airport at Coxtown, this ensured that the town would not dwindle and die, the way some seaside towns in England had succumbed when cheap holidays to Spain became the norm. The barracks had been dormant for over 20 years, as there were plenty of brownfield sites from various industries that had sprung up and died in the previous century before cheap imports destroyed them. The barracks were initially left to decay. It was finally deemed surplus to requirements but had no buyers when the Army decided it was of no further use to them. There were a number of reasons for this. Besides financial reasons, there were a number of hazardous materials in the area, primarily asbestos, which made developing the site economically unviable until now. I drove up to the security gates. Sure enough, they were still manned, now by a local security company who had been trying to keep the site secure ever since it closed down. Over the years, the site has been targeted as you would expect. Scavengers looking for materials like lead and copper from the buildings in the outlying areas of the site, where fencing could be accessed from the adjacent woodland, without a likely chance of being caught. The buildings were in a very bad state of repair due to these thefts. The last time I was here was on a school trip when I was 16. Looking back, it was a thinly veiled attempt at recruitment by some young lads, getting them to play soldier for a day. After joining with some new recruits for 30 minutes of marching about, the Army was definitely not for me. Keith Thompson, or my mates Terry, Gavin, Steve, and Paul, our fate lay elsewhere, and that's why I am here. After we left school, finding local employment was not easy. There was a large 2-year project about to start building a dual carriageway by us about 30 miles away, so we all became subcontractors. I won't deny it, it was hard work, but being young, it felt like a boy's adventure. By the end of the 2 years, we decided that laboring wasn't the way forward. If we could, we were better staying in the industry. Paul's dad helped us out. He lent us the money to buy a couple of second-hand dump trucks, and we managed to get a job on the latter stages of the project. We worked hard, never let the main contractor down, and they offered us work at the end of the 2-year project on a new bypass. We accepted, but that meant working 200 miles away. To start with, we all lived there, sometimes 7 days a week. We knew this wasn't sustainable to maintain the relationships we had at home, so we drew up a rota. One of us would be guaranteed a long weekend every week. Another would have a day-night off midweek. Plus, there were weekends when we all came home. By the end of the project, Coxtown Groundworks Limited was up and running and never looked back, now turning over millions, employing 30 people, as we head into 2024. The school we went to was a mixed comprehensive. We all did okay academically, even though none of us stood out. In the latter stages of our school life, we met the girls who would become our wives. For the first few years, working locally, things were great. We had money, girlfriends, and a town with a lively nightlife, mainly because of the barracks. When we got the contract working away, the girls had a rough time. They stuck together and built a social life while we were working away in the South. It wasn't always easy, as our individual relationships were at different stages of development. 2 got married by the end of the 2 years working locally. The rest of us did, over the next few years. After that, all our futures were cemented into the great lives we had built for ourselves, until I saw the ghosts on the wall. So I was at the barracks to carry out a survey. We were going to tender for the demolition of the site and make it viable for redevelopment. The work today was to understand the scope of the job and what it would involve in the broadest sense. Starting at the furthest point from the entrance, we surveyed buildings that were in a very poor state of repair, for one reason or another. Halfway through the survey program, we came to a building that was almost untouched, possibly due to it being close to the guardhouse and having solid steel doors but no windows. So the building consisted of a large main room with 2 further rooms off the end of the main room, again, both with solid steel doors and locks on the inside. Sorry, mate, it's just somewhere in here. John, I guessed, who was in his late 70s, was the security guard. He had been in the Army himself, lucky enough to be posted here as it was closing down as a military base. So when he left the Army a few years later and returned home, he took a job with a security company and had become as much of a fixture as the building itself. As he tried different keys, he started laughing. Not sure what we'll find in here, wouldn't be surprised if there are still a few women tucked away in these rooms. I looked at him, slightly bemused, not understanding the comment. Just then, the key turned in the lock and he pushed the heavy door open. It protested with a loud screech as it moved on dry, rusty hinges. I showed him my torch around. The first thing it picked up was a drum kit. The skins were ripped and covered in a thick layer of dust. Some music stands were propped against the wall, with numerous sheets of music scattered on the floor in a number of old and saggy armchairs, with a few settees either tipped over or upside down. Then I saw it. It didn't seem to fit. Before I moved, John spoke. Initially, this was where the barracks band kept their instruments, and they practiced in the main room. For the last 5 years, before the barracks closed, the room's main purpose changed. It became the unofficial club of Cockay 5. They were a small band playing music in local pubs. You might know them, they weren't all. They also played music with numerous women from the town in here. We walked across the room to see what the torch had illuminated that didn't seem to fit. There on the wall was a large oak board. It was the type you would expect to see in a golf club. It would list all the revered members who had reached the pinnacle of the game to become club captain for the year, being immortalized by being added to the board. But this wasn't a golf club, not for musical prowess, and no honor was given on this board. It was titled Cockay 5's Hottest Chicks. There were 20 square, clear plastic wallets, attached, or had been attached, to the board in 4 columns, 5 in each, numbered 1 to 20. I went to one of the wallets and pulled a faded Polaroid photo out of the thin plastic sleeve. Even though it was faded and starting to disintegrate, it was clear what the photo was. A woman was kneeling on some cushions as she was being licked by 2 men, both giving the thumbs up to the photographer. I told you, they were a bunch of drunken bastards, often bribing the guards at the gates by giving them a swig now and then. The women would come and go as if it was a bus station. He chuckled, but I could feel a lump starting to form in my stomach. I was now looking at the next photo, and it was unmistakably Gavin's wife, Felicity, sitting naked riding a man. As I scanned through the photos, I felt sick, then really sick when I saw the photo in slot number 1. Kneeling in a tight circle, seemingly enjoying themselves, with blissful looks on their faces, were 5 women. Their faces were looking up, covered in semen, and each had a cock rammed into their faces from 5 unseen men, standing behind each one. I staggered out of the room, just making it outside, before I started to dry heave, followed by breakfast before deciding that the spasms I was having meant it was time to get out and throw up on the concrete. I looked back at John. He looked concerned. He told me to stay put as he went back to the guardhouse to get some water. As he walked away, I turned back inside and gathered all the Polaroid photos. I looked up and John was in the doorway. I need to take these, John. There are people I know in here. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. Promise me you'll destroy them. They are only ghosts on the wall. Trust me, there is no good in chasing them. The best thing to do is to burn each one. So we walked around the site for the next few hours. I was elsewhere in my head, and John was carefully reminding me to take notes and photographs. I think he knew that somehow I was close to somebody in the photos. He didn't know it was 5 women who had been deemed the filthiest whores in the town. We shook hands as I left the site. I could see him in the rear-view mirror shaking his head sadly as I pulled into the lane to head home. I can't remember driving home. The next thing I can clearly focus on was the glass of Oved rum and Coke I found myself staring at. I was sat at the dining table. My whole life has been built on a lie. I thought I had reached this point with the most caring and loving person beside me, and she would be there until we finished the deal we made all those years ago. Until death do us part. I carefully took out the Polaroid photos I had taken, separating the ones I could see, including the bad girls, and the ones I couldn't. I took the photos of the people I didn't know, put them in the fire grate with a lighter, and watched. Hopefully I was saving some fuel from the pain and heartache I was feeling, as the photos curled up and burned to dust. Back at the table there were 6 photos. There was a close-up of a pair of lips that were wide open, with what I could only make out was saliva dripping from the bottom lip, and a cock rammed deep into the person's mouth. But it wasn't a person, it was my wife. I could see the small mole on her chin. Even though the photo was ruined, I knew my wife's facial features so well. After all these years, it was her. 3 other photos were of Steve's wife, Vicky, Paul's wife, Penny, and Terry's wife, Anne. Vicky was sat, facing a chap on the sofa, with another guy kneeling on the edge of the sofa, right behind her. I presume she was being fucked in both holes by the look on her face as she looked back at the camera. Penny, she was lying on her back, with a cock in her mouth, whilst another cock could be seen squirting onto her chest. The final photo I could make out of Anne was holding onto a wall from behind. There was another one of them riding a man, cowboy style. The photo was very blurred, so I couldn't make out who it was. All of them, the 5 of them, had been whores from the start of what we thought was a perfect life. I picked up the group photo. They looked happy, even pleased with themselves, as the sticky mess vividly depicted what they had been doing. Flipping the photo over, they had all signed their names like a legend on a map. Ensuite, I couldn't take it anymore and threw my glass at a picture on the wall of a supposedly happy couple, standing on top of the Eiffel Tower. So I used to think those smiles said what a happy marriage. Now, one of them looked back at me and said, "Yeah, I am smiling at you, you clueless bastard." I took pictures of each one on my phone, then carefully put the originals away in the office. The rage was making me tremble. At 6'6", built like a tank, I felt I could do more damage than one of our earth movers. I had never raised a hand to my wife, but right now, if my wife, Chrissy, walked in, I wanted to beat the betrayal out of her. No, I couldn't stay here. 15 minutes later, I pushed my modified Suzuki Rug 500 Gamma out of the garage. It was a rare bike, my pride and joy. I loved riding it out on a Sunday morning, but today, it was simply a tool to unleash my anger. I had changed into jeans, riding boots, leather jacket, and helmet as I strode out to the bike, purposefully. Flipping the petrol on and ignition, my leg swung over the seat as I pulled the choke out. Twisting the throttle, I prodded the starter a couple of times before a noise like 4 chainsaws from hell rattled, echoing down the cul-de-sac at the end of my small street. A 2-stroke, disc valve engine, based on a GP bike of the time. My father had left it to me when he passed away. It was tuned with a megaphone exhaust that belched out smoke and a guttural, angry clang echoed through my small estate as I warmed the engine. When it was warm enough, I pulled away from the drive and headed for the numerous roads that crisscrossed the county. This was going to be a destructive ride. My head was full of scenarios that had possibly happened in the past, may still be happening, and potential scenarios likely to occur in the near future. Out of town, on the open roads, I pinned the throttle wide open. The engine screamed and the exhaust howled as the close ratio gearbox rapidly accelerated through the gears, the tachometer needle constantly curving rapidly around the face as the acceleration lightened the front end, as it tried, or did, lift the front wheel off the ground. I was filled with rage for that slut. She had deceived me for years. Her and those other bitches must have been getting into bed every night, laughing at what they were doing, how they had been deceiving us for all these years. Like a snake bite, the rage poisoned my mind that used the bike as a tool to vent my anger. I tore through traffic as if it was standing still, at times hitting a heating 50 miles per hour on a 60-mile stretch as all the vehicles merged into a multicolored, blurred entity on my right as I hurtled past them. If the bike was feeding off my anger and hatred, it was becoming as unstable as my thoughts. Pushed to the limit, the tires and chassis were barely coping, with a couple of near misses becoming uncontrollable as I hit some uneven stretches of road. There were a couple of times the bike was over-revved through some bends at over 100 miles per hour when it was too close to the edge. I might as well have been sitting at home playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun. What did I care? I was living without purpose anyway. Leaning into the tank, at about 130 miles per hour, a sign indicated that the road was changing from dual carriageway to a single carriageway. I could see an articulated lorry in front of a number of cars, with one coming in the opposite direction as I bore down on all of them, still carrying a considerable amount of speed. I kept the throttle back as I cut down the outside before realizing I was probably not going to make it. It looked like my luck had run out. Cutting across the solid white line that separated the traffic, I was about halfway across the articulated lorry, on my side of the road, as the oncoming car was no more than 50 yards away, so it felt like slow motion. For a split second, I could see the whites of the eyes of the driver of the oncoming car as he slammed on his brakes. His hands were trying to force the horn button through the middle of the steering wheel. His mouth was moving, probably screaming obscenities at me. Idris. As he drew level, I was now a couple of feet from the cab of the articulated lorry on my side. A wall of air pushed against me, making me wobble, with inches between me and both vehicles on either side. Plastic and glass disintegrated in a flash as my right mirror exploded as it hit the lorry. My jeans rubbed against the wheel and I thought I was about to go into a head-on collision. Then, suddenly, I was through it. wobbling through the collision, and the wall of air formed in the slipstream of the oncoming Arctic. I could hear the driver of the Arctic sound his horn, a deep, guttural groan. He was probably giving me as much verbal abuse as the other lorry driver. One thought ran through my mind. If I died, that bitch would have everything. Did I want that? A mile down the road, I stopped at a roadside cafe and parked at the far end of the car park. I got off the bike and looked at the damage to the bike. My jeans, boots, and jacket were torn to shreds as I took my helmet off, placing it on the seat of the bike. I can honestly say I should have died a few minutes ago. In a secluded corner of the car park, I did something I had only done once in my adult life. The last time was when my daughter was born. I cried, not just cried. A 6'6" man stood looking across the field, sobbing like a child, whilst feeling immensely ashamed as I felt tears streaming down my face. I was in such a state, I didn't notice the sound. A car pulled up behind me, a door opened and closed. Suddenly a hand was placed on my shoulder, trying to turn me around as a woman's voice, laced with anger, spoke, "You dangerous, stupid, fucker?" As I turned around, the look on her face quickly changed from anger to concern. I was still sobbing. She knew big guys like me weren't born to cry. Stepping closer, the woman, who was around 5 foot tall, wrapped her arms around me, just holding me. It took a few minutes for me to regain my composure, and she suggested we go inside for a coffee. No way was she letting me back on that bike, especially after she had taken the keys from the ignition switch. As we stepped into the cafe, she told me her name was Dr. Annika Wells. She was a pediatrician returning to Manchester after a conference when I had rattled her car window as I rode past her before almost killing myself, riding between the articulated lorries. Inside the cafe, she pointed me towards a table in the far corner while she ordered drinks. I went to sit down, looking and feeling completely lost for the first time in my life. "I apologize about earlier. I thought you were just one of those stupid bikers who think our roads are just race tracks." She smiled at me as she sat opposite, pushing a lad across the table towards me. "Sorry, I told you who I was when we went in, but I didn't ask for your name." My voice was almost a whisper, punctuated with broken sentences. I told her it was fine, and to call me Keith. She nodded slowly with a kind smile. Kind, well, she was a healer. The sympathetic smile a doctor has when you are discussing an illness. "I'm sorry, but I have to ask this. Were you trying to kill yourself?" I looked at her and she became slightly vague as my eyes welled up and my heart thumped harder in my chest. I didn't answer but tried to shake my head, indicating no answer to her question. "Okay, you don't have to answer, but was it due to a loss, possibly of a family member?" Her voice was so gentle, concerned, as I nodded, with tears streaming down my face. I tried to find my voice. "I just found out my marriage was built on a lie. I have been married to a woman who has been a whore for years and I didn't know it." She breathed out and I could see her relax slightly. My assumption was, the death of a marriage wasn't as bad as losing a close family member, although at this moment death wouldn't be as bad as this. Then I opened up, telling her my life story until I was sat here, drinking this coffee. "Keith, I understand this is difficult for you. You have implied that you had no concept or reason to suspect that, other than what you have discovered, your wife had ever strayed from her marriage vows. Had you not seen the photos and were not sitting here right now, would you describe your marriage as having any flaws in any way?" "Yes, that slut has been deceiving me." "No, I'm sorry, Keith. I don't mean to be forceful, but you're not answering the question I asked. Try to put your emotions to one side for a moment. If I had spoken to you last night and asked if you thought your wife was a whore, what would you have answered?" I sighed and answered. She had a feeling she knew what the answer would be. "I thought my marriage was perfect." "Good. Look, I am not trying to judge. All I want to do is help you look at this rationally and not do anything rash. That could destroy your life, and as far as I know, your children's lives too." I noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. It seemed odd for an attractive woman in her 40s to be single. For some reason, I felt uncomfortable and asked her if she was married. "No, divorced once and now separated from my second marriage. You know what they say, third time lucky?" I could see she was trying to lighten the dark conversation, but it was failing miserably. I tried to respond. I wanted to be honest. "I'm sorry, I guess I'm the same as you. How have you dealt with the pain of knowing your marriage is over?" She hesitated before replying, very subtly. There was a slight change in her demeanor, a flicker of anxiety evident. "I'm sorry, Keith. I was the one who was unfaithful in my first marriage. I think I got what I deserved when my second husband left me for his secretary." I could feel my anger rising, and she was looking at me, her eyes meeting mine, with an intensity I'd never experienced before. She was angry too. "Go on, judge me, Keith. When a man can't control himself and needs to use his wife as his personal punching bag, she will find a way to escape." And I did. I had an affair and then married a man who loved me, at least for a few years, before the allure of a younger secretary became an opportunity too tempting to resist. We sat there for a while, until the anger subsided from her face before continuing the conversation. "I have to go, Keith. Do you have anyone to collect you? I don't think you should go back on that bike." I shook my head before saying, "No one I can call without implicating them in all this. You are right, I need to try and get my head straight before I decide how to play this, despite the anger and hatred I am feeling at the moment. Even though I won't abandon the bike, it's incredibly rare, worth a few quid, and more importantly, has great sentimental value. It was my dad's new bike and he gave it to me before he passed away. If it has to go, I will find somewhere to park it and lie flat on the floor beside it." I could see she was weighing up what to do, considering the options she could see ahead of her. The first thing she did was give me a business card, her work details. "You have a rough time ahead of you. You are trying to solve a problem that, I think, you may need professional help with to work through your issues. Give me a call over the next few days. I'll call around to find someone who can help you when you need it." She took my bike keys out of her bag and handed them to me, across the table, but didn't relinquish them. "Can I leave you with a thought, Keith? You said that the bike was of great sentimental value. What if you left here and it was damaged beyond repair? Be realistic. The way you ride, it wouldn't be surprising if that happened. Would you abandon the bike? If you repaired it, would you always look back at the day it let you down and only see that day?" With that, she handed the keys to me, the doctor's smile back on her face. I understood what she was implying. To draw a comparison between my marriage and my bike, I could see her logic. The difference to me was my wife had deliberately broken the trust between partners. If the bike broke down a mile from here, it was due to wear and tear, or that I pushed it too hard. Was that the answer? Had I pushed our relationship too hard in the early days? As she walked to her car, I thanked her. It had helped me calm down enough to be a more rational human being, and I needed to be that person to be able to get home safely. She started the car, lowering the window to speak. "Please calm down. Don't let me read about you in the news later. There is enough guilt going around without adding mine to the mix. Try and stay calm when you get home. I know it will be difficult. Most importantly, listen before you act. You have a grenade. If you pull the pin, there will be no going back. Be careful, Keith, and please do call me." She smiled and she was gone. I took a deep breath. It was time to go home and talk to Chrissy, my wife. A few minutes later, I was back on the road, heading home. I tried my best to control my emotions, but I was still riding quite aggressively as my thoughts whirled around my mind. The more I thought, the more they spun into a tornado as I imagined how this would play out. Should I tell everyone who these women really were? As I pulled up on the drive, I used the remote to open the garage so I could go inside and put the bike away. Chrissy's car was there. Just seeing it was enough to make my anger start to boil. AICHI told me to calm down. I knew she was right, but my feelings weren't. As the bike was in, I hung up my leather and riding gear before using the inner door to enter the house. So as I stepped into the kitchen, Chrissy's face showed a look of concern. Had the damaged photo hinted to her what was about to happen? The moment she saw my face, it quickly changed to fear as she stepped towards me, hands outstretched ready to touch me. The thought of her touching me made me step back, away from her, which left her stunned. I didn't say anything. The rage was quickly forming a tidal wave inside me, and I was ready to unleash it. I walked past her and into the living room. I switched on the TV and sat in a chair, not the sofa. She followed me in and I pointed to another chair. "What's wrong, darling? You scared me. Something wrong at work today? You went out with Penny and she didn't say anything." I ignored her as I went into the photo library on my phone, selected the photo of her, with a cock in her mouth, before streaming it onto our 70-inch TV. As the image appeared on the screen, she reacted. No, she screamed at the top of her voice as she almost leapt from the chair and towards me. Her eyes were wide open, full of fear. I jumped up too, raising my hand as she frantically tried to grab me. Not to hurt me, she desperately wanted to embrace me, to seek solace. That was not going to come from me. Tears started to fall freely as she pleaded, begged me to let her near, to hold her. Her arms were flailing, trying to get closer, but at 5'5", she was simply overwhelmed. Eventually, she crumpled to the floor and quickly latched onto one of my legs. I wanted to kick her away, The ingrained, never hit or physically harm a woman, drilled into me by my parents, was kicking in. However, I was sorely tempted. All I could do was stare at the image on the TV of the woman clinging on to me, sharing an intimate act that I thought she had only ever shared with me. Yet she had been there sharing it with someone else. How could she do this to me? I didn't realize I was shaking as tears welled up in my eyes. I felt numb as the wretched human being clung to my leg, sobbing uncontrollably. I could hear her trying to speak. The words weren't always fully formed or almost incoherent due to her state. As I stopped focusing on the TV screen, I understood what she was saying. "Please don't leave me. You love me, it was just a mistake. Please, please, please don't leave me." I tried to pull away, but she clung onto my leg tightly. Her broken face was looking up at me as I glared at her with angry eyes, before barking at her. "Get up and sit on that chair." The shock of me yelling at her was enough to make her flinch. I had never spoken to her in this way in our entire lives. As she released me and scrambled back to the chair, she pulled herself into a fetal position as she continued to whimper. "Keith, it was so long ago. I was young and did a stupid thing." I changed the image on the TV. It was now the image of all 5 girls in a semicircle. It stopped her mid-sentence as she shuddered and recoiled back as if the TV was a giant radioactive block to try and get as far away from it as possible, and passed out. I stepped towards her. She was still gasping for breath, so I got a glass of water plus dampened a flannel to wipe her forehead and face. So I stood there. I felt like a bastard for doing this, but she deserved it. What did she expect to happen if I found out? I needed to know the truth, to find out the truth once she came around from this fainting episode. As she returned to the land of the living, she looked up into my angry face, trying to shrink back in the chair. She was visibly trembling as her waterworks started up again, whilst I stared down at her, emotionless. "I am so sorry, Keith. I have lived with this shame locked inside for so long. All of us have. AICHI lived in fear every day for the first few years, afraid that the awful mess we created would be torn apart, come back to haunt us, ruin all our lives." Pulling her legs tightly under her, she curled herself up into a ball, with her arms stretched above her head, her hands clasped behind her hair, shaking her head in what I believed was some form of denial. She was shaking so violently, it reminded me of a documentary we had watched about some illness. I think it was called St. Vitus Dance. Never mind, it was just an observation being made as I waited for her to calm down enough to continue. After a while, a broken voice spoke. Who told you? Why wait until now? Why not just do it then? Save us from carrying all this guilt for so long." I answered calmly. "How I found out is irrelevant, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I have been married to a whore, and I didn't know it until today. I hate you for what you have done, all of you, you deceived us. Is Rachel my daughter?" So as the last syllable of my sentence escaped my mouth, she jumped up and lunged at me, taking me by surprise as she slapped me across the face before I grabbed her wrist, pushing her away, far enough for her to be unable to continue, physically at least. That didn't stop her from screaming obscenities at me. "You bastard, you think I would do that to you? Let you raise another man's kid without knowing? Where's my supportive, loving husband?" She continued to thrash and scream at me, her spittle hitting my face. I pushed her away and she fell back into the chair, with her eyes glaring up at me. My rage was exploding. "He is gone. You killed the poor bastard years ago, from the minute you started cheating. He just didn't know it until today. Now, all that is left is the monster that hates every fiber of your being." Mentally, I was on the verge of taking her life before throwing her out. My anger was bubbling over and I was ready to unleash it. I stormed out, grabbed my car keys, and raced out of the house. In the car, I took a deep breath and wiped my eyes. My chest was pounding and I was shaking. If this didn't somehow trigger a heart attack, I knew my heart rate could keep me going for years. But years of what? I started the car and drove off. Unlike before, I was controlling myself, trying to drive within the legal limits. The driving range, that's what it was. When I need to think, hitting a few balls always helped, so I headed that way. Fortunately, I always kept golf clubs in the boot, as you never knew when you would get the chance to hit a few balls. At the driving range, I didn't hit balls. I tried to angrily throw them into the next county, before realizing that other people were there, looking at me. I slowly regained my composure, and with it a bit of decorum as I hit balls in a more controlled way. After a couple of hours, I walked back to the car. I was still angry, but it had subsided, at least for the time being. What I wanted was answers to the questions. I reasoned that now I had opened up, both of us could try and discuss it, without me yelling and Chrissy sobbing. I was tired, not hungry, but I still wasn't ready to go home. Driving to the nearest pub, I went inside and ordered some food and a pint. I picked at my food as it was delivered and drained the pint, then the next one, and the next. Reaching into my wallet, I pulled out a card, Anika's card, and looked at it. I sent her a text. Sorry for trying, I couldn't control my anger. We'll try again. Only a few seconds later, my phone buzzed. You want to talk about it? Call me? That was the answer I was looking for, so I rang her number. Hi Keith, I'm sorry it has become so bad. Where are you now? I told Anika what had happened, how Chrissy had reacted, and how things had quickly spiraled out of control before she had slapped me, after Anika said that it was an insensitive remark about my daughter. However, he understood I was finding it hard to contain my anger. So, what now? Are you heading home? How much have you drunk? I realized we had been talking for an hour, and since I had entered the pub I had downed 5 pints, enough to get a free night's accommodation at the police station if I had been caught driving. I admitted I needed a taxi. Look, head home. If you both struggle to talk without shouting, just go to the spare room and tell her to sleep there. Hopefully it will be easier to talk then. However, there is a question you should start considering, and only you can make that decision. What do you want to happen in the end? Call me tomorrow. Let me know how it goes. So that was it. The million-dollar question remained. Earlier in the day, I had been clear on what I wanted to do. After calming down whilst hitting golf balls, now I wasn't so sure. My mind was starting to battle with various shockwaves if I brought what I had discovered into the limelight, and that certainly wasn't pretty. I needed some answers to the questions that were burning in my mind. I ordered an Uber and went home. Time passed quickly. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, and I was exhausted. I wanted to sleep, to think about what I knew, and then try and discuss it tomorrow. Chrissy. I had a great workout at the gym. Penny had tried to join me, and we'd had lunch in town at a new pub that had opened up nearby. We chatted about all the usual things, the kids, the house, and our husbands, plus we had started discussing how to celebrate 25 years in business that all our husbands had built up together. We wanted to come up with a big, secret surprise for all of them. I left, happy and thinking about cooking something special for Keith for dinner. But when I stepped into the house, something was up, something wasn't right. I looked at my phone to see if I had any texts from Keith. He usually sent me a lunch text. Sometimes silly, sometimes just a simple "Liu, XX," but there was nothing. I noticed there was a bottle of rum on the table and the smell of alcohol in the air. As I walked through the dining room, I stepped on broken glass. What the hell had happened? Then, I saw something that made me shiver, that brought out my deepest fear. The fact that my favorite picture, the one of the two of us smiling, loved up, celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary on top of the Eiffel Tower, was ruined, smashed glass everywhere. As I went closer to inspect, I could smell rum. Keith had deliberately done this. I ran to the downstairs loo and was sick. It couldn't happen. Surely not after all this time. I sat at the table trembling and texted the other girls. I think DD Day has arrived. Nothing more. The day we thought would never come. It may be nigh, but why now? Disaster Day and divorce. As time had dulled the events of the past, we had started to jokingly call it DD Day, as we felt comfortable, now all just a collection of dark, distant memories, until today. Beret. My phone started buzzing. We had a group call. We were all anxious and scared. Nothing made sense. It had happened so long ago. Why was it surfacing now? We decided the best thing to do was to wait and see what Keith might say, if anything. It could genuinely be just a really, really bad day, out of the ordinary. For him, and the smashed picture was just a coincidence. God, I hope so, but I couldn't shake this bad feeling twisting my stomach. He had never, ever exhibited any behavior like this in all the time I had known him. Everything crumbled when he walked in. The moment I saw him, the look on his face was terrifying. I had never seen that dark, angry look before as he stepped into the kitchen. For years, we, our friends, had considered him a gentle giant, a man who didn't raise his voice or say a bad word to anyone. The only thing that could have brought this about was that he now knew what we had done all those years ago. I felt numb. We ended up in the living room. I desperately wanted to hug him, to show him that I loved him, loved him more than anything in this big wide world. I lunged towards him and he rebuffed me. For the first time in our lives, he pushed me away and I fell to the floor. In desperation, I clung onto his leg. I needed to show him how much he meant to me. A few minutes later, I was pleading until suddenly I found myself looking at the TV screen, and to my horror, it was me. The ghastly ghost from the past dragged up to stare back out of the screen. I remembered it being taken years ago, just a few months before I married. My life was over. Everything I had done since to atone for those 6 crazy months had been swept away by that image. Then, he showed me another picture. I couldn't look at it. I felt faint, and the next thing I knew, my husband was wiping my forehead with a flannel. I was hoping I was waking up from a nightmare. All I was doing was stepping back into the nightmare that I had created. I curled myself up. I wanted it to stop. Then the man I thought loved me delivered the cruelest blow possible. He asked the most devious question: was our daughter his? I shouldn't have done it. Something exploded inside me. As I jumped up and slapped him, it took him by surprise for a second or two before he grabbed my wrist, stopping me from hitting him anymore. I think we were both screaming at each other, his face contorted with pure hatred, unadulterated. I knew his parents had brought him up to be respectful and never raise a hand to a woman. At this moment, I felt that thought had left his mind. Then, just like that, he disappeared. I sat on the floor, like a ball, rocking back and forth. This couldn't be happening. Please let this be a nightmare. It wasn't my husband who had walked in, but a terrifying monster, a monster I had helped create, and now it was awake and wreaking havoc. I tried my best to calm down. I needed to let the other girls know. As far as I knew, he would spill the beans when he left. We had all tried our best to prepare for this moment. However, the expectation was that it would happen years down the line, not when we should be preparing to drift off into the world of entertainment like the retired. That was 4 p.m. All the girls agreed to be here by 7 p.m., waiting for Keith, hoping he was contemplating, somewhere, deciding how he would handle this. When the girls arrived, they were shocked at how bad Keith had reacted. They couldn't understand how he could be so angry. To them, he was a gentle giant. Each one wondered how their own husband would react, except Vicky. She knew how Steve would react. We sat and discussed how we should try and handle Keith. If we tried to push him away, he would run, I was sure of that, but he would act with all the ferocity he had. In the end, we agreed to stay calm, regardless of his demeanor. We hoped that safety in numbers would help him come down from his high horse. Then, we encountered our biggest problem. How much should we reveal? What did he know? We didn't know how he had found the photos. Did he have the originals, or had someone just sent him the disgusting images he had shown me? So at the end, we decided to stick to a plan. He knew about the photos, we would work with that. If he came up with anything more, I doubted any of us could recover from the aftermath. Right on 10 o'clock, the front door opened. He surprised us all, as I had been expecting him to park the car inside the garage. As he walked towards the living room, he stopped when he realized that the 5 women from the photo were all sat, looking at him nervously. The house seemed quiet when I arrived home, no lights on upstairs, and it seemed like the only room lit was the living room. I opened the door and stepped towards the living room, expecting a bit of a chat with Chrissy, only to be met by 5 people I really didn't want to see, sat together. Chrissy, Anne, Felicity, Vicky, and Penny. Immediately, hatred coursed through my veins as I searched for the most hurtful words. The rage was taking hold as I started to try and inflict pain. So I'm not sure which collective noun is appropriate. Is it a coven, a den, a gaggle of whores? Come on, Keith, we know you're upset, but it doesn't help right now. That was Penny. She always took the lead when the girls wanted to speak out. Time to put her back in her box. Sorry, Penny, my mind was elsewhere at that point. Perhaps I should have gotten a neighbor to shove a cock down your throat to make you shut up like the photo. I understand why you have developed an obsession with dirt and germs. It's from that half-assed army camp back then. You could scrub your tits for 100 years, and you would never get the semen stains off them. That was it. She slumped back in her chair and put her head down. The others looked at me anxiously. If you think you can get what you want by siding with me, you are in for a shock. As for you, Chrissy, I hope we can try and have a civil conversation now that the truth is out, but it seems like the whores need to stick together, or stick together like the photo I have you all. We will discuss it, Chrissy, remember my words. Well then, girls, you clearly have something to say. Who wants to go first? I warn you, I am not in the mood for games. So if for 1 minute I think you're trying to pull wool over my eyes, I will kick you, and I mean all of you, out of my house with a view that you will never darken the door again. So as I said it, I looked straight at Chrissy. I wanted to make sure she understood that this applied to her as much as the other. I was surprised when Anne spoke up. She was usually the quiet one. I know you probably don't believe us. We all had to carry the dreadful weight of those 6 months of shame. I assure you, it lasted 6 months and then we stopped. Nobody, and I mean nobody, in the lives of my children, has breached the vows of our marriage since then, and in fact, we have all tried our best to be the best wives we could be. I could feel it, the rage was bubbling up inside. Her verdict, 6 months, marriage vows, no, surely not. I glared at my wife with my lips compressed as my jaw clenched, making my words hiss from between my teeth. Come on, Chrissy, you mean it happened after we got married, right? They all shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing the rage was building within me as I started to pace around the room. With my fists clenched, I looked at Chrissy, waiting for an answer, but she was frozen. Felicity was the one who answered, her voice trembling. So no, Keith, Chrissy and you weren't married. Only me and Anne were married when this happened. I shook my head in disbelief, looking at the two women. At least Anne looked ashamed, with a flushed face, her head hung down, looking at the floor. Well, she should be. Felicity looked as if her mind had left her as tears streamed down her cheeks. So, now we have some truths. It lasted 6 fucking months, as they say, miraculously it stopped. 2 of you were actually married. That means the rest of you were either engaged or had your wedding day booked. Why did you do it? Were we not good enough for you sluts? How many did you all fuck behind our backs? Penny found her voice again and recounted their story. You remember when we all started work locally, after we left school and university? Suddenly, we had some money. The pubs were always packed. There was always a disco or a band that all of us, including the boys, loved to go to. They were great times. Then you bagged that first big contract. 1 minute we were still teenagers, then suddenly we had partners working away from home and we all felt a huge gap in our lives when you all went away. Initially we stopped going out for a few weeks, but it didn't work. So we made a pact to stick together and look out for each other. And it worked. You'd be surprised how many of your so-called friends tried to get at us, thinking we would be easy, but bullshit, you wanted to get laid. You weren't just easy, you were proper cock-hungry whores. I was angry. It felt like they were trying to portray themselves as nuns who had fallen from grace for a moment. Keith, I am not going to lie, we did it. We weren't trying to do it. You remember that bright band, the Cockay 5, so they were the soldiers who played in the pubs. We all loved them, including the boys. We went to see them a few times, we danced like we used to, when you were all still here. One day, it was a great night. They said they were having a drink back at the base in their club. We didn't see any harm in it, and we went with them. Looking back, we shouldn't have gone. We had all had too much to drink. We all missed the boys. I think they knew that and they saw us as easy targets. 5 soldiers and 5 girls, the maths added up well for them. Vicky was the next to speak. We are not blaming the drink, it was a mix of everything that was affecting us. They were fun lads. Back at the barracks we danced. Then, the next thing, there were some kisses before things went too far. I won't lie, we were all willing participants at that point. I am ashamed to admit it, you wanted the truth, that's the truth. For God's sake, Keith, we were as young as you. Didn't you get your kid off when you were working away? So that did it, I stepped towards Vicky to get within inches of her face, before hissing through clenched teeth. Listen, whore, I have never touched another woman, other than my wife. The worst I have ever done is kissed a woman on this floor. And when I say kissed, I mean a peck. So don't you ever try to imply that I was in the same boat as you bunch of fucking sluts. For some reason, it threw her. I looked around the room, and it wasn't what they had expected to hear. I didn't think the other lads had been getting up to it when working away, but I wasn't always there, all the time. Maybe 1 or 2 of them had been getting up to it and the girls had heard, tarring us all with the same brush. I am so sorry, Keith. We all thought you would get a bit of action when you were working so hard in those early days. I frowned. Looking at all of them, they understood me enough to know that I was telling the truth. I continued to question them. So, finish this shitty story. Was this an everyday thing, a weekly thing? What the hell was it, and with who? Finally, Chrissy joined the conversation. Keith, we didn't keep a record. You think it happened 10, 12 times. The girls all nodded as she continued. Not all of us were there together, all the time. Let's say, each of us went out 6 to 8 times and only with the boys in the band. The others all murmured and nodded. That's it? You went out for 6 months, had 6 or 7 shags only with those 5 fucking morons? There were a few very quick glances between all of them, before they all mumbled or nodded agreement. But something didn't sit right. They were hesitant, they were lying or hiding something. This is your last chance to be honest, all of you. 6 months, 6 or 7 shags, only 5 dumb bastards. If I find out that one of you is not being truthful, I will bring the sky crashing down on your world so fast you will never recover. Last fucking chance. Ace. Once again, there were quick glances between all of them. They nodded. I had had enough. Girls, go. I want to speak to my wife alone, as she has a lot of explaining to do. They still sat there, their eyes darting between each other and me. It was Chrissy who asked the question they all desperately wanted to know. Please, Keith, don't do anything rash. I understand how you must feel. I know you hate us right now. We are begging you, if you let this out, not only will we suffer, your friends, their husbands, all our children, they will pay the price. Can you promise to at least sit tight until everyone has had a chance to get their heads straight? Fear. Yes, fear was etched on each of their faces. Anne was sobbing uncontrollably as Penny did her best to comfort her. But there was a problem. Those fucking photos kept flashing through my mind. I couldn't forget what I had seen, and I couldn't bury the hatred I was holding in my heart for the conspiracy they had all colluded to maintain. Cigarette they had all colluded to maintain, until it was broken this morning. Please, all of you, go. Leave me alone, let me think. You don't deserve this, I won't say anything, at least not for now. Some of you might want to think long and hard about this. Maybe it's time to be honest, tell your husbands what you have done. I had had enough. Bolint. No, you, get out of my house. I am sick of the sight of you. Geo. The rage was now pouring out of me as they all scrambled to their feet, visibly scared of me. As they left, Chrissy stood by the door, looking at me miserably. You want me to go too? I haven't made any arrangements. I didn't expect this from you. Chrissy, go to bed. I am tired, exhausted, and I've had enough. Don't ever do this to me again. Don't ever try to ambush me. I won't forgive you. Go to bed, leave me alone, and think about what you want to say to me tomorrow. I need to understand why you did this. Do you want to come to bed with me? I really need to feel you, please. Let me. Joe to bed. Listen to what I am saying. Please give me space, or I will take the easy option right now. I am sleeping in the spare room, where I intend to stay indefinitely. So that worked. She ran upstairs, crying, and slammed the bedroom door. After pouring myself a glass of water, I trudged upstairs to one of the spare rooms. As I passed our bedroom, muffled sobs could be heard through the door. The thought crossed my mind, she deserved it. This is what she had done. After undressing, I collapsed onto the bed and surprisingly fell asleep quite quickly. I woke early. That was nothing unusual. Years of camping, hotels, and getting up early had made that the norm. As I came down the stairs, the biggest surprise was that Chrissy was awake. 6 a.m. was not normally her time. It was clear she had been up for a while, as she had laid out a full English breakfast, along with a freshly brewed pot of coffee pull. She smiled, or at least attempted the best she could at that moment, greeting me in a weak manner. A few minutes later, she put the breakfast down in front of me, plus a portion for her on the other side of the table. As she sat down, she started. Keith, I am so sorry. Stop it, Chrissy. Put a sock in it. Let's have breakfast. Clear up the kitchen, then we'll start. I promised myself I'd keep calm. Yesterday was a big shock, the anger. As I finished, she gently spoke. I know that wasn't your true self. I awoke something in you that has never been there before, and I am so sorry, Keith. I will tell you everything, I promise. She suddenly stopped, mid-sentence. Her hand had reached across the table to touch mine, but I pulled back, making sure I didn't reach for hers. Her eyes were full of tears as she slowly drew her hand back. I said softly, Eat. Once we have finished, we'll talk. She nodded sadly, as we both picked at our food. Neither of us were hungry, even though we both tried our best to make it seem normal. Once we had finished and cleared up, I made a pot of tea before we sat down. She looked pale and strained, clearly unsure where to start. Then, I told her to start at the beginning, not the group outings, why they went to the barracks, perhaps knowing what might happen if they did. She held her teacup, took a sip, and put it down. She didn't look at me, but down at the teacup in front of her. We missed you all. 1 minute you were all here, going out, carefree and enjoying our lives. It was great, we all loved each other, and it seemed like everything was going to be perfect. Then, you got the job working away, and that was a huge shock to us. If we went out as a couple, we would be hit on, and it was bad. Some of your so-called friends who you went to school with tried really, really hard to get at us, and I mean really hard, to catch us off guard. We came up with a plan. We would cut back on going out, but stay together. Protection in numbers. It worked teeth. We kept our distance from local people and our team members, and things calmed down. We didn't feel as vulnerable. The band, you remember how popular they were here at that time? We started going to most of their gigs. We would always end up at the front, dancing, and things escalated, and no, not like that. We all became friends, and I mean friends without benefits. Yes, there was some flirtatious banter, but nothing in it. Then everything changed. Word got around that you guys were partying all night when you were away, and that included casual sex with the women you were meeting. We were all devastated. We didn't know what to do. We thought about confronting you all. We loved you and felt you loved us. So we were all young, full of hormones, and thought maybe that's what life was like when your partner was working away. It was the catalyst for what happened next. Stop it, Chrissy. I need you to rewind a bit. Who said we were getting up to it? That's a blatant lie. I have never touched another woman other than my wife. Yes, occasionally, and I mean occasionally, we might have been in a nightclub or a pub, but other than some dancing, flirtatious banter, and as you described yourself, that was it. So why would you believe some prick who was probably trying to get into your knickers? Who was this prick? Aim. She just looked at the teacup, slowly shaking her head. Then I noticed tears falling beside the teacup. Chrissy, I need you to look at me and tell me who this prick is. She looked up, with a look of agony, the tears still falling freely. I can't tell you, Keith. Please understand, it is the only thing in this whole mess. I can't tell you who it was. So you're going to throw away everyone's marriage to protect some lying, deceitful prick. They are that important, that you have to sacrifice everything? Tears were now flowing freely as she buried her head in her hands. After a few seconds, she spoke a pathetic sentence. I almost didn't hear it. So I asked her to repeat it, and it shocked me to my core. It was one of those weekends when they came home. What the hell? One of the guys I considered brothers had created this storm in a teacup. She had to be lying, or there had been a misunderstanding. There had to be. Chrissy, are you sure? This is really important. Who did he tell? All of us. He came back, with love bites on his neck. His partner said they were over. He said he had something to tell us all. And he did. He told us. He told us that you were all getting up to it. I am sorry, Keith. All those years, the mistakes we made, it all stemmed from a lie. Even though I had said I would stay away, I was fuming. It was obvious, whoever had tried to save their own skin. By throwing the rest of us under the bus, I pressed hard. But even through the crying and sobbing and the breakdown, Chrissy refused to budge. She said there would be more damage than good from something so long ago. I didn't agree. Someone had to pay. Somehow I just hadn't worked out how. We didn't get much further than what had been discussed the night before. The reason behind the cessation of the group fucks with the band was supposedly that they realized they had all been deceived. Initially, the band had realized one night that the girls felt they were all being lied to, so the chink in the girls' armor was still there, and they exploited it. That made sense, but something still seemed wrong. For all her efforts, Chrissy couldn't make eye contact with me, and it felt rehearsed. My feeling was that it had been formulated long ago, to pacify something that I felt was being buried deeper in the sewer of this supposed truth. But how could I dig up something from so many years ago? So if he stopped, Chrissy was exhausted, so I left her to it and went to hit some more golf balls. I had made a couple of work-related calls and only communicated with my 4 partners via text. One was a snake, and I needed to work out which one. I had a restless night, unlike the night before. How could I find out what really happened and what made them suddenly stop? Then, the answer hit me. Before the era of cloud backup for IT stuff, I used to have portable hard drives that I kept safely, just in case. So as IT developed and I continually upgraded the kit, I would keep the old backup drives in the loft. I was always scared of data loss or someone getting their hands on it for nefarious purposes if they fell into the wrong hands. Yes, I didn't remember ever throwing them away. I would look tomorrow. The next day, I looked around the loft. Almost giving up, I found a cardboard box containing hard drives, along with a few old, replaced and long-forgotten mobile phones. After pulling them down, I realized that the labels I had used had all peeled off. The adhesive had long since lost its effectiveness. I was going to have to go through them, one by one. By the late afternoon, I had found what I was looking for, including a period that matched up with what I had been told. I finally found some suitable software online that allowed me to open the data on the drive, so I started to scroll through it. As I looked, I realized there were hundreds of saved chat logs from the messaging program the girls used before mobile phones could do anything more than make calls and simple text messaging. I started to read through the chat logs, scanning for anything I was interested in. Then I found it. The snake was Paul. He had come back with the love bites and tried to justify whatever he had done by throwing mud at the four of us. What a bastard, I couldn't believe it, all to save his own skin. I kept reading. The girls were furious, that was clear. Then Penny entered the chat. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Yeah, those words had surely been ringing in our lovely daughter's ears in the pub on their first night at the army camp. Fuck. Even though I was looking at a snapshot of history, it felt like a knife was slowly twisting in my heart. I knew how these chat logs would end, but I couldn't stop reading them. Just then I was given a bit of a reality check. AICHI called me. Hi Keith, I haven't heard from you, so I thought I'd check in. Even though I don't really know you, I realize that someone is in a very distressed state, who needs a friendly voice. So I thanked her for calling, and recounted to her what had happened, including my rediscovering the chat logs. Can I offer you some advice, Keith? You won't like it, stop reading those logs. You will turn over some stones that have dreadful creepy crawlies underneath, but they are history, you can't change what happened. You can only punish yourself by reliving something you didn't even know about until a few days ago. I understand, but I need to know. There is something else. The way they acted when they were all here last night, I am sure they are hiding something as bad as what I know. Keith, please. I saw how distressed you were the other day. Don't play with those hot coals you have found. If you keep digging, you will start to create a fire. A fire that can consume you, even leave scars for the rest of your life. I know I shouldn't, I can't help it. I need to know. I need to know exactly what happened back then. I could hear a sigh, then silence for a few seconds. I will pray that you don't find anything. I will keep my phone handy, call me if you need me. I will send you a couple of contacts that might be worth contacting, who might help you work through this. I was really concerned when I saw you the other day, at the cafe. I'll call you in a few days, by Keith. So then, she was gone. I sat contemplating what AICHI had said. My head knew that ignoring history was the sensible thing to do. However, my heart felt differently. My wife had betrayed me, the man she had committed to loving. We weren't married, but engaged. We shared a rented flat, so for all intents and purposes, we were a couple. Then I sat, thinking back. Did she ever give me any indication that she was deceiving me? I couldn't remember. The only thing that sprang to mind, she had some down-below issues for a while, which she felt depressed about. As I thought about it, those few months were probably the only difficult time we had as a couple. She wanted me home, blamed me for working away too much. It had caused the depression. Eventually, she came out of it. We got married not long after that, and we continued to live fairly happily as we adjusted to the work-family life that would become the accepted norm. There was a knock at the door. Chrissy politely asked if I would like some tea and a sandwich. I nodded and went back to the logs. I was engrossed in my reading when there was a sudden noise. The clatter of cutlery beside me startled me. Chrissy was stood there, petrified, with her eyes wide open. She had dropped her teacup and sandwich. Get those keys, Keith, I beg you. Don't read them. It was so long ago, it doesn't matter now. We were young, stupid girls, and we were just letting off steam. Her fear was very evident. All she was doing was confirming to me that there was something else waiting for me within those logs. Something that was surely going to be very unpleasant. Keith, please stop and talk to me for a minute. I've been thinking about this, and if you give me a few minutes, I hope you can see things from a different perspective to how you are currently seeing them. Let's clear this mess up first. I will hear you in the kitchen with a fresh pot of tea. She rushed to get a broom, dustpan, and bucket. I flipped the screen and shut the computer down. If she came back, she wouldn't be able to check what I had been looking at. I left her to clear up, made a couple more pots of tea, and sat at the dining table waiting for her to return. When she sat down, I could see that she was shaking, her face ashen with worry lines etched deep in her face. When you went to work the other day, you were heading to the barracks to prepare a quote for the job you were going to tender for. I have been thinking about those pictures. Did you happen to see them there? The pictures, as she mentioned, the images flashed into my mind. I sighed before nodding to her. Okay, now I get it. Damn, no, the wall they had. Stop it. I can't handle it anymore, Chrissy. The pain of seeing that board and those photos was too much for me to bear. Never mention that again. This time she nodded. She clearly realized that was the splinter in my mind. Even though I thought she had run out of tears, they were still streaming from her eyes. Those logs you are reading, we all expressed our feelings at the time, Keith. It was just girl talk. I never thought you would see them. I'm not sure how far you have got, but we talked about our experiences in those chats. You said the photos were hurtful, the chats will only amplify those emotions? I looked at her, bewildered. I know it was Paul. He tried to save his own skin by lying to everyone. I still haven't figured out how to get back at him. Please, Keith, don't read any more. It will hurt us both if you do. Can I ask you, up until that morning, had you ever suspected me in any way? Once we all sobered up, we made a pact to back you 100%. Never complain, regardless of how long you worked or how far you were from home. So I made sure I was the perfect wife for you, a great chef in the kitchen, a wonderful lady in the public eye. And your whore in bed, and I want to stress your whore, not anyone else's. I never refused any of your advances, made sure you were always satisfied. Would you agree with that statement? I nodded slowly. I couldn't deny that what she was saying was the truth. Our daughter, your daughter. Didn't I create a loving home for her to grow up in? Whilst you were working away, didn't I cope, even when I was weak or unwell when she was a baby? When she started school, wasn't I the one who made sure she could go and do whatever the latest craze was? Dance classes, football teams, judo, whatever, I was always there for our daughter. Keith, who was there for your parents in their final painful years? Who cried with your mother when the chemo made her lose her hair, so reassured her that she was still a perfect woman? Who was there for her until the very end, witnessing the pain she was inflicting on your family as she slowly slipped away from us? Then your father, when he had given up all hope and you needed to keep working, who turned their pain inwards, suffering in silence for the loss and pain of everyone around them. Me, Keith. I did it all, because I was your loving wife. I can go on, but the pain you know you felt over your father's stroke doesn't need to be brought to the surface. Remember, I was there for him to the very end.
She stopped. She realized she was pushing me, but not in a good way.
Please, Keith, I am not trying to sow seeds of doubt. You were not here, you were building the future for all of us. A future that has provided the three of us with everything we have today. You and I? We had a few chats about retiring, doing the things we wanted to do together. Would you agree with those statements? I couldn't disagree with her statement, so I nodded again. Remember, back when you were 16, as far as we know, that was the only time you got into trouble with the police, apart from parking and a couple of speeding tickets. I remember your dad being furious, grounding you for a month. It felt like the end of the world, not seeing you. Why was that, Keith? I got caught stealing a mountain bike from the woods. Yes, I remember. You didn't steal it, although you were pretty sure it was legal when you bought it. Luckily, you got a simple police warning. What did your dad say? Consider it a lesson in life, because when you are fully grown, the punishment will be much harsher. So the same goes for us, Keith. We followed the word of someone who is trying to save their own skin without searching for the truth. We were young, not fully grown. Were you branded a thief or a crook afterwards for that bike? No, you weren't. Am I a bad wife for what happened back then? I am not going to answer that question. So the decision is yours, but please, please think about what I have said. We sat in silence for a while, then I stood up and walked towards my office. Her voice had been strong for the last few minutes. Her belief in her own thought and convictions had given her that. She could see that I wasn't having a light bulb moment, if that's what she was hoping for. She knew I would continue with the logs, regardless of what happened. As I left the kitchen, her weak, trembling voice was barely audible. Please, I beg you, don't look back anymore. A few minutes later, she broke my concentration by walking into the room as I was slowly, but steadily, looking through the chat logs. I was genuinely surprised at how much they had used it and how long they spent chatting. Sorry to interrupt, I have to pick my mother up and take her to the hospital for a checkup. Do you want to change? I shook my head, not really looking at her but glancing to see her reaction. She looked subdued and defeated as she turned and walked away. So not long after she left, I had reached the last chat log. I must have upgraded the system at this point, which meant there was another hard drive to find. I felt emotionally drained. Reading about my wife and her friends openly discussing their infidelity, they didn't hold back when describing the encounters at the barracks. I made myself a coffee and responded to a few work-related messages and emails. At some point, I needed to get back on track. The quotes for the work at the old barracks were important. It would be the icing on the financial cake as we started to run towards the next part of our lives. That thought made me feel confused. I kept going from one extreme to the other regarding my marriage. One particular passage seemed to nail the coffin shut on my marriage. The girls were all describing how good one of the musicians was. It was just called the cock. The chat log vividly described him being the biggest any one of them had ever had, and he knew how to use it. One chat log was almost entirely about him. The women discussed how many times they had come with him in one go, and that included my wife making some pennyworth comments of her own. That made me think, did that mean I had never measured up, sexually, in her eyes? The rage was getting harder to control. I also started to think about what she had said earlier about our relationship. When it had all stopped, she had poured her heart and soul into this relationship, and that had remained the case until this very day. I didn't doubt, for a second, that she loved me. The question was, did I love her enough to somehow let this live in the past? As I was finishing my coffee, the doorbell rang. When I answered it, Paul's wife Penny was standing there. "Hi Keith, would you mind if I came in for a quick chat?" I told her Chrissy wasn't here. She told me she knew Shinaji had gone to the hospital. She wanted to talk to me. I opened the door for her to come in and offered her a coffee as we sat at the dining table. Taking off her jacket, I picked it up for her. When she usually popped over to see Chrissy was in gym leggings and a Stamlex. Today, she was wearing a short skirt that showed off her legs and cleavage. Plus, makeup and perfect shoes, which I would describe as come fuck me shoes, which put me on guard. Penny and Paul never had children. Her body looked no different to when she was in her 20s. Plus, yes, I admitted she was hot, but I never thought about getting warm in that area. Keith, we are all absolutely terrified. We feel like we are on death row, waiting for the final verdict. Some of us are crumbling under the pressure. Our husbands, your friends, are questioning what is going on. I know you found out that Paul was the moron who tried to cover his tracks by implying that you were all doing what you could when you were away. Until you exploded the other day, that was the history we believed. When we grew up from those 6 crazy months and stopped what we were doing, we stuck to our plan, being the best wives we could be. We know you are in a tough spot. You now know what others don't, and we understand. When left in the dark, you feel you are being betrayed by the trust you had. I am willing to do anything. Get down on my knees, beg, try and forget about what you have discovered. I can tell you, I have put Paul through hell for the last few days. It all stemmed from what he did, and at some point you will need to have a serious talk with him. He has admitted it. We all get older and wiser. None of us are young anymore. We can look at the bigger picture rather than the narrow, short-sighted view we had in the moment. That is what has brought us to this place. She stopped. Up until this point, she had exuded confidence, which was typical of Penny. But now, there were small signs in her demeanor that showed a flicker of doubt and fear. I know you are going through those old chat logs. Damn, Keith, I'd forgotten about them. I am pretty sure they helped us sober up for a long time when you all started working away. I know that's how you found out that Paul was the one who started everything. I guess you have read on. I remember we can say, talked about what happened in those logs. Please, Keith, it was just girl talk at the time. Look in the mirror. I see you tearing yourself apart, ripping yourself to shreds over an old story that you now know. We all felt ashamed of what was in those logs, but please, for everyone's sake, let it go. It can only create more hurt and damage. 8. Why, Penny? Why is there more hurt and damage from this? To me? To Chrissy? To you and Paul? There was a pause before she answered. I could see she was searching for the right words. When she replied, I was pretty sure that the bravado helped her to continue. If you keep digging into the past, you will find things that will destroy everything you hold dear. Your marriage, your business, your friendships. Look at how you have reacted to all this so far. You will ultimately press the button on becoming vicious, and there will be no turning back. Having said that, she stood up and walked around me. Standing slightly behind me, she gently put her hand on my shoulder. I continued to stare into the space she had just vacated. She spoke now softly, in fact, very gently. I know you feel hard done by, deceived, robbed of information that might have made you change life choices, but there are ways to balance the scales, Keith. Having said that, she leaned down and gave me a gentle kiss on my cheek. As she did, I recoiled and quickly stood up. Fuck you, Penny. What the hell was that? You came here and gave me a pity fuck, something to even the score. All you have done is solidified my determination that you are all whores. What does that mean? Once a deceiver, always a deceiver. Now get out of my house. She turned and headed for the front door. At the kitchen door, she paused, turned and addressed me. "Nobody brought me here, Keith. I hope you can see that I am serious about the carnage you will cause. As for being a whore, a deceiver, I am like Chrissy. I have spent years since being the best wife I could be. I have never strayed from Paul, never. You don't understand, do you? I've been there. I know you probably won't bite, but stop and think, for fuck's sake. I have been prepared to make another sacrifice. A personal sacrifice on behalf of all of us, if it stopped you tearing down the house. Remember my words, if you keep looking back, you will pay a terrible price." Then she was gone. I paced around the kitchen. What the hell? How did she think that me walking out on Paul would make everything good? What did she say? Balance the scales. How does getting with her balance the scales? I needed to collect myself, so I headed to the driving range again, hoping to calm down. That's it for part 1. I will be updating soon, so stay tuned.